They called him a man of God, a beacon of hope for his community. Reverend Samuel Potter was adored by his congregation and respected by everyone who knew him. He preached about faith, family, and honesty, values he claimed to live by. But behind the pulpit, Samuel carried a devastating secret, one that would ultimately lead to betrayal, violence, and an unspeakable tragedy. How does a man so revered, so trusted, let everything spiral out of control? What happens when the truth we fear most is the one we cannot escape? This is the heartbreaking story of a preacher, a family, and a web of secrets that unraveled in the most shocking way. Before we dive into this tragic case, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more tales of betrayal, secrets, and tragic consequences. Samuel Potter stood in the spotlight every Sunday morning, his deep voice booming through the church as he delivered sermons that left his congregation inspired and uplifted. Known for his unwavering dedication to the less fortunate, he was a man who seemed to embody the very principles he preached. Humility, morality, and compassion. It was no wonder Samuel had become a pillar of his community, a symbol of hope for those who sought guidance. But behind the public adoration and carefully curated image lay a man wrestling with demons no one could see. Samuel wasn't just a preacher, he was a father to 19-year-old Grace Potter, his pride and joy. Grace had been the light of his life since her mother passed away when she was just a child. He had raised her on his own, teaching her to value truth, justice, and perseverance. In many ways, she was the embodiment of everything he stood for, or at least everything he wanted the world to believe he stood for. Grace, an inspiring journalist, with a sharp mind and an unshakable sense of determination, adored her father. She saw him as the moral compass not only of their family but of their entire community. To her, he was more than just a preacher, he was a man who lived his faith, a man who practiced what he preached. Grace's admiration for Samuel was evident to anyone who saw them together. She often described him as her hero, the man who had taught her to stand firm in her convictions. To the outside world, Samuel and Grace were the perfect duo, a father and daughter bound by faith and purpose. Together, they represented hope and strength, a shining example of what a family could be. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming in the foundation of their seemingly flawless relationship. Samuel's struggle was invisible to those who looked up to him, but it was there, lurking in the shadows of his life. His congregation saw him as a rock, a man of unwavering principle, but the truth was far more complicated. Samuel knew the weight of the secrets he carried, and he also knew that if Grace ever discovered them, the bond they shared could be destroyed forever. For now, though, the illusion held strong. Samuel was a beloved preacher, Grace was his devoted daughter, and together they were everything the community believed them to be. But illusions can only last so long, and for the Potters family, the truth was waiting just around the corner, ready to shatter everything they had worked so hard to build. For years, Samuel Potter carried a secret that weighed heavily on his soul. It had begun innocently enough, or so he told himself. The pressures of leading a growing congregation, counseling those in need, and being the moral backbone for an entire community had taken their toll. Late nights turned into sleepless ones, and the stress became unbearable. That's when Samuel first turned to cocaine, convinced it was a temporary escape, a way to keep himself going for the sake of everyone who relied on him. But what started as an occasional indulgence quickly became a crutch. The relief it provided was fleeting, and as the years went by, his dependency grew. Samuel began to spiral, sinking deeper into a world he preached against every Sunday morning. To support his addiction, he found himself entangled with Marcus Kane, a ruthless drug dealer who had no qualms about exploiting Samuel's position of influence. Yet, despite his growing dependence, Samuel maintained the facade of a moral leader. He stood before his congregation each week, delivering impassioned sermons about integrity and faith while secretly battling the shame and guilt of his hidden life. To the outside world, he was untouchable, a man of God who could do no wrong. But behind closed doors, the cracks in his carefully constructed image were beginning to show. Grace, ever observant and fiercely loyal, couldn't help but notice her father's behavior had changed. He seemed distracted, restless, and often irritable. Late-night absences became more frequent, and unexplained financial struggles began to weigh on their household. Samuel dismissed her concerns with vague excuses about church business, but Grace wasn't convinced. One evening, while searching his study for a book, Grace stumbled upon something she was never meant to find. Hidden in the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of papers, was a small plastic bag filled with a white powdery substance. Next to it were a rolled-up bill and other paraphernalia. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. Shocked and heartbroken, Grace sat frozen, staring at the evidence of her father's secret life. The man she had idolized, the man who had taught her to value truth above all else, was living a lie. For a moment, she thought about confronting him right then and there, demanding an explanation. But instead, she put everything back exactly as she'd found it, closed the drawer, and left the room, her mind racing. Over the next few days, Grace began collecting evidence, small things she hadn't paid attention to before but now seemed glaringly obvious. Receipts for large cash withdrawals, whispered phone calls, and late-night disappearances all pointed to something much bigger than she had imagined. Her father was living a double life, and Grace was determined to uncover the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. What she didn't realize was that her investigation would put both of their lives in danger, and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a devastating conclusion. Grace could no longer hold back the flood of emotions that had been building inside her for weeks. Her heart ached with confusion and betrayal, but the time had come for answers. She waited until Samuel was alone in his study, a place she knew he would be hiding from the world. The tension in the air was thick as she walked in, closing the door behind her with a deliberate click. Samuel looked up, a flash of unease crossing his face before he masked it with a forced smile. "Grace, what's going on?" "You've been acting strangely," he said, his voice betraying none of the panic he felt inside. Grace didn't respond with pleasantries. Instead, she walked toward him, her hand shaking as she placed the evidence she had collected on the desk in front of him. The plastic bag. The receipts. The notes. Everything she had pieced together. "I know about the drugs, Dad. I know about Marcus Kane." For a moment, Samuel sat frozen, his face pale as the words sank in. He quickly scrambled to defend himself. "Grace, you don't understand. This is all a misunderstanding." "No," Grace interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not a misunderstanding. I found the stash. I found the evidence. The money you've been spending. The late-night calls. You can't hide from this anymore, Dad." Samuel stood up suddenly, knocking his chair backward, his eyes wild with fear. He started pacing the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "Please, Grace. You don't understand. This will ruin everything, the church, my reputation. I can't lose all of that." Grace's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You're a hypocrite, Dad. All this time you've been preaching about integrity, about being a man of faith, and this is what's been going on behind closed doors." Samuel's facade cracked. His posture slumped, and his eyes filled with tears. He collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. It's all gone so out of control. His voice faltered, and for a moment, the man she had once idolized seemed small, broken, and lost. He looked up at Grace, his eyes pleading. "Please, don't tell anyone. I'm begging you. If this gets out, everything we've worked for will be destroyed. The church, the people who look up to me, they won't forgive me." Grace's heart wrenched, torn between the love she still felt for her father and the growing sense of betrayal. She stared at him, unsure of how to respond. He had always taught her to stand for truth, no matter the consequences. But this was her father, how could she turn him in? But Samuel's desperation only deepened. You don't understand. Marcus is dangerous. If this comes to light, I won't just lose my reputation. He'll make sure our family suffers. You have to trust me." Despite the fear in his voice, Grace's resolve hardened. "I can't just ignore it, Dad. You need help, and you need to face this before it destroys us all." Her words hung in the air between them. Samuel's face contorted with guilt and shame as he finally broke, unable to keep up the charade any longer. "I'm addicted, Grace. I've been using for years. Marcus Kane, he's been blackmailing me, pulling me deeper into this mess. I've tried to get out, but it's too late now." Grace's eyes burned with tears, but her voice was steady. "You need to stop hiding, Dad. I'm going to make sure you get help. I'm going to make this right." Samuel shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "No. Please, Grace. If you go to the police, if you tell anyone, Marcus will make sure we pay for this. I'll lose everything, and we could be in danger." But Grace, undeterred by her father's pleas, resolved to continue down her path. She had already seen the toll addiction had taken on him, and she couldn't bear to watch it destroy him any further. She couldn't allow fear to control their lives. "I don't care about the church or your reputation, Dad. I care about you. I care about us. And I'm not letting you hide behind this anymore." With those words, Grace made up her mind. She would keep pushing, despite the risks. She would uncover the full extent of her father's involvement with Marcus and expose it for the world to see. It was the only way to save him from himself, even if it meant tearing their family apart in the process. And so, despite Samuel's warnings and the growing danger that lurked in the shadows, Grace pressed forward. She began to dig deeper into her father's dealings, determined to uncover the full truth. But with every step she took, the web of corruption grew more tangled, and the stakes became higher, putting both of their lives at risk in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The weight of Samuel's secret had been pressing on him for far too long, but nothing could prepare him for the devastating turn his life was about to take. When Marcus Kane learned of Grace's investigation, he knew he had to act quickly. Marcus was no stranger to violence, and he had no intention of allowing anyone, especially Samuel's own daughter, to expose the dangerous web of drugs, corruption, and fear he had ensnared the preacher in. Marcus tracked Samuel down one evening, his eyes cold and menacing. The moment Samuel saw him, his stomach turned. The last thing he wanted was for Marcus to get involved in Grace's investigation, but it was too late. "You've got a choice to make, Potter," Marcus growled, his voice low and threatening. "Your daughter keeps poking around, asking questions. You either shut her up, or we'll both pay the price. She's digging deeper, and if she keeps going, things will get ugly." Samuel's heart raced in his chest. He had spent years protecting Grace, raising her to be a strong and independent woman, but now he was caught in a nightmare where protecting her was becoming impossible. He could see the darkness in Marcus's eyes, the very same darkness that had dragged him into this mess. "I'm trying, Marcus. I'm trying to stop her. She won't listen. Please, just give me time," Samuel pleaded, his voice breaking. He knew it was only a matter of time before Grace uncovered the full extent of his dealings with Marcus and the people who threatened them both. But Marcus wasn't interested in waiting. He was tired of playing games, and Samuel's inability to keep his daughter in check had pushed him over the edge. "You don't get it, do you? This is bigger than you or her. She keeps going, she'll ruin everything." Samuel stood frozen, his mind racing. He loved Grace more than anything, but he couldn't deny the fear that gripped him. If Grace didn't back off, Marcus would make good on his threats, and Samuel wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to protect her. That evening, Samuel tried everything he could think of to warn Grace. He sent anonymous messages to her phone, hoping she would see the danger and stop digging. He even left cryptic notes in her belongings, urging her to be careful and to stay away from the truth she was so determined to uncover. But Grace, confident in her pursuit of justice, saw the notes as nothing more than scare tactics. She refused to believe that her father, her rock, her hero, could be involved in anything that dangerous. She was so sure of herself, so certain that the truth would bring resolution, that she dismissed the warnings and pressed forward. As the days passed, Grace grew closer to uncovering everything. Samuel, torn between the love he had for his daughter and the fear of losing everything, knew it was only a matter of time before Marcus took matters into his own hands. But it wasn't until one cold evening, when Grace was walking home, that the horrifying reality hit. Marcus had been waiting for her. He had tracked her down, knowing that she would be walking alone. As Grace strolled down the quiet street, unaware of the danger that loomed ahead, Marcus stepped out from the shadows. He grabbed her before she could react, his grip tight and unyielding. "Grace Potter," he said, his voice a cold whisper. "This is where it ends." Grace struggled, trying to break free, but Marcus was too strong. She screamed for help, but it was too late. In a violent, brutal moment, Marcus took her life. The shock and terror that filled her eyes as she gasped for breath would be forever etched into Samuel's mind. When Samuel received the call later that evening, his world shattered. His daughter, the one person he had vowed to protect above all else, was gone. His heart screamed in agony, a mixture of grief and guilt threatening to consume him. He had failed her. He had failed to protect her from the very darkness he had brought into their lives. As he rushed to the scene, the weight of his actions, the choices he had made, the lies he had told, crushed him. His addiction, his association with Marcus, his refusal to be honest with Grace, it had all led to this. The life he had fought to build for her, the family they had been, was gone. And now, there was no turning back. Samuel stood over her lifeless body, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one more painful than the last. He had been too late, and now Grace would never have the chance to understand why he had done what he did, or why he hadn't been able to stop it. He was consumed by a suffocating guilt that threatened to tear him apart. In that moment, everything came crashing down. The preacher, the father, the man who had once stood before his congregation with pride, was left alone in the wake of his own destruction. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, he knew that nothing could ever undo the horror he had allowed to unfold. The tragic breaking point had arrived, and there was no redemption to be found. The news of Grace's murder spread like wildfire, shocking the community and sparking a frenzy in the media. The public, still reeling from the tragedy, was quickly gripped by sensational headlines. Grace, a well-known activist, had been hailed as a hero, fighting for justice even in the face of unimaginable danger. But now, as the investigation unfolded, a new question arose: was Samuel Harding, the man who had once been seen as a victim of Marcus Kane's manipulations, somehow involved in her death? Reports connected Samuel to Marcus, suggesting a dark link between the two. The media didn't know the full truth, but they were quick to paint a picture of betrayal and intrigue. In the midst of the chaos, Samuel could hardly bring himself to face the world. Alone in his apartment, he stared at the evidence Grace had collected. It was overwhelming: photographs, documents, audio recordings, all evidence of the massive criminal empire Marcus had built. And buried within it, the undeniable truth: Grace had been murdered because she got too close to it all. Samuel knew it, and the guilt ate away at him. But in the quiet of that room, as the weight of his failure bore down on him, something shifted. He couldn't let Grace's sacrifice be in vain. He couldn't let Marcus win. With trembling hands, Samuel gathered everything Grace had worked so hard to uncover. The recordings she'd made, the files she'd compiled, they all pointed to one thing: Marcus was responsible for countless lives destroyed, including Grace's. Samuel couldn't let him escape. He sent the evidence anonymously to the authorities, ensuring that Marcus's empire would come crumbling down. It wasn't long before the authorities acted on the information. A raid hit Marcus Kane's operations, and the walls began to close in on him. The case against him grew stronger by the day, and the public slowly turned on him as more details emerged about his criminal activities. Grace's recordings, combined with Samuel's testimony, provided irrefutable proof of Marcus's role in her death and the many crimes he had orchestrated. Marcus Kane's arrogance had always been his shield, but now, it was his downfall. In the dead of night, Samuel stood waiting in a remote location, the darkness surrounding him as he steeled himself for the confrontation that had been brewing for months. He had to face Marcus, to demand answers and closure. The sound of a car engine broke the silence, and a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of him. Marcus stepped out, his imposing presence unmistakable, the same cocky smirk on his face that had always infuriated Samuel. "You think you've won?" Marcus sneered, his eyes cold. "You're nothing, Samuel. You were always just a pawn in my game." Samuel's fists clenched, his anger rising to the surface. "No," he spat, voice trembling with fury. "You destroyed everything. You killed the one I cherish the most." Marcus let out a laugh, dismissing Samuel with a wave of his hand. "And what? You think you can play hero now? You think you're some kind of savior? You're just as weak as everyone else." "I'm not weak," Samuel replied, his voice firm despite the fear that still lingered in his chest. "I'm here to make sure you never hurt anyone again." Samuel pulled out his phone and showed Marcus the live feed, the flashing lights of police cars growing nearer. Marcus's smirk faltered as he realized what was happening. He moved toward Samuel, but it was too late. Law enforcement had arrived, surrounding Marcus before he could get any closer. Officers rushed in, forcing him to the ground, and in moments, he was handcuffed and restrained. "You're under arrest for the murder of Grace Potter," an officer announced, "and for your involvement in numerous other crimes." Marcus struggled, his rage palpable as he shot one last glare at Samuel. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over." Samuel didn't flinch. "It is over," he said quietly. "You're done." In the courtroom, Marcus's fate was sealed. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury had spoken. He was sentenced to life in prison, a fitting end to a man who had once seemed untouchable. As the judge's gavel came down, Samuel felt a sense of finality. It wasn't justice that he sought, it was closure. Grace had been the true hero in all of this, and now, at least for Samuel, there was a small measure of peace. Outside the courthouse, Samuel walked past the crowd of reporters. He didn't have anything left to say. The world had witnessed Marcus's downfall, but for Samuel, it was a quiet victory, one that still left a hole in his heart. Grace was gone, but her legacy was intact. She had fought for something real, something that mattered. And in the end, that was what would survive. As the dust settled on the trial and Marcus Kane was locked away behind bars, Samuel Potter found himself at a crossroads. The world had seen him as a man of faith, a leader who preached of redemption and grace. Yet, in his darkest moments, he had lost sight of those very principles and allowed his addiction and secrets to destroy the life he had built. But now, with the weight of his daughter's death heavy on his soul, he knew there was only one path forward, to take full responsibility for his actions, no matter the consequences. The decision to confess publicly was not an easy one. Samuel had always been a proud man, protective of his image as a preacher and father. But after everything that had happened, the guilt of having failed Grace weighed more heavily than any reputation. In a tear-filled statement to his congregation and the media, Samuel openly confessed his addiction to cocaine, his ties to Marcus Kane, and his involvement in the criminal activities that had ultimately led to his daughter's death. He acknowledged his failings, admitting that the secrecy and shame had cost him the trust of those who had once looked up to him. The reaction was mixed. Some saw Samuel's confession as an act of courage and accountability, while others condemned him for the choices that had led to the tragedy. Samuel did not seek forgiveness from the public, he knew that would never come. Instead, he sought to make amends in the only way he could, by dedicating the rest of his life to helping others who had fallen into the same traps he had. His confession didn't spare him from the consequences of his actions. Samuel was sentenced to prison for his involvement in the drug trade, though the judge acknowledged his willingness to cooperate and come forward with the truth. He was sent to a facility known for its rehabilitation programs, a place where he could not only serve his sentence but also reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. In prison, Samuel found a different kind of calling. With a newfound sense of humility and a desire to make up for his past, he began working with other inmates who struggled with addiction, guilt, and the demons of their own making. Using his own experience as a cautionary tale, Samuel led group therapy sessions, shared his story with others, and helped guide men and women toward recovery and redemption. His own journey of reflection and healing became the foundation of his work, and while the pain of losing Grace never truly left him, he knew that helping others find peace and redemption was the only way he could honor her memory. In the quiet moments of his prison life, Samuel often thought of Grace, her bright smile, her unwavering pursuit of truth, and her love for justice. He couldn't bring her back, and he would never forgive himself for what had happened, but he found solace in knowing that the truth had been exposed, and that, in some way, Grace's fight had been vindicated. Though he was confined behind prison walls, Samuel began to experience a kind of freedom he had never known before. His redemption was not about avoiding punishment but about embracing the painful truth and using it to make a difference. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that he was, perhaps, on the right path. Samuel's journey was far from over, but as he worked each day to help others find the strength to confront their own demons, he began to see that perhaps redemption, like grace, was not just about what he could receive but also about what he could give. And in that act of giving, he found a measure of peace that had once seemed impossible. The story of Samuel Potter was not one of perfect redemption, nor did it offer a neat resolution to the pain he had caused. But it was a story of a man who, in the aftermath of his darkest hour, chose to face the truth, take responsibility, and, in the process, try to help others heal. It was a story of a man learning that, even in the deepest shame, there is still the possibility of redemption, and that the road to healing, though long and uncertain, is worth traveling. The tragic story of Samuel Potter reverberated far beyond the small town where it began, igniting a widespread societal debate. People from all walks of life grappled with the questions it raised about addiction, morality, and the crushing cost of living a double life. Samuel, once a man held up as a beacon of virtue and strength, became the symbol of how secrets, fear, and shame can unravel even the strongest of people. The case forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about the pressure to maintain a perfect public image, particularly for those in positions of power and influence. The idea of keeping up appearances, whether for the sake of a congregation, a family, or a community, had led Samuel to hide his darkest secret, an addiction that not only jeopardized his own life but ultimately cost his daughters. For so long, he had feared the consequences of revealing the truth, but in the end, his silence proved far more destructive than his confession could have ever been. As the community reflected on the painful lessons of Samuel's story, it sparked a broader conversation about how society views addiction. Rather than offering compassion and understanding, many people who struggle with addiction often face judgment, isolation, and a lack of support. The story highlighted the need for greater empathy and better systems in place to help those in crisis feel safe enough to seek help before their lives spiral out of control. Could Samuel have saved Grace if he had confessed earlier, if he had sought help for his addiction instead of hiding it? It's a haunting question that lingers, one that underscores the devastating cost of living in secrecy and fear. Samuel's story is a harrowing reminder of the dangers of keeping secrets, the weight of societal expectations, and the human cost of living a lie. It's a tale of betrayal, not just of a daughter by her father, but of a man betraying his own integrity. It is also a story of redemption, as Samuel's painful journey toward accountability and helping others through his mistakes offers a glimmer of hope in a deeply broken situation. But the tragedy of Grace's death is not something that can be undone. And as we reflect on her life and the choices that led to her tragic end, we are left asking ourselves, How can we create a society where those struggling with addiction, fear, and shame feel that they can seek help before their lives spiral beyond repair? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the consequences of hidden truths and the toll of silence, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more tales of love, secrets, and tragedy.